Okay, so you send in a bunch of articles about climate policy. Looks like things are heating up in more ways than one, huh?
Yeah, you could say that.
We're seeing a total flip from what the previous administration was doing. Trump 2.0 is, well, he's making some big moves, but what do they really mean? For climate action, and for you, let's dive in.
You got it. These executive orders are a total departure from where the U.S. stood on climate before.
Let's break these executive orders down. There's a bunch. Reversing electric vehicle policies, more drilling for oil and gas, canceling offshore wind leases, even declaring an energy emergency. It's like they're hitting the gas on fossil fuels and slamming the brakes on renewables at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And this shift away from renewables, it could have a big impact, especially with the clean energy sector booming like it is now.
Yeah.
We're talking about a global market that was $2 trillion last year. Solar and wind power, yeah, but also all that advanced battery tech and energy efficiency solutions. The U.S. could be missing out on a huge economic opportunity.
And then there's the huge thing. The U.S. is bailing on the Paris Agreement again.
Right, and that's a big deal. Almost 200 countries signed this thing, right? The goal, to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5, the U.S. pulling out. Especially since they've been such a big emitter historically, it sends a signal they're going solo on climate action.
Which is interesting because the articles you sent also highlight how 2024 was the hottest year ever recorded. And scientists are saying we've already blown past that 1.5 degree target. I mean, do you think this signals that the U.S. stance on climate change has actually changed? Or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Okay.
It's hard to say for sure what's behind this policy shift. Some people say it's all about short-term economic wins, energy independence, while others see it as, I don't know, like they're trying to undermine global climate efforts.
It's definitely complicated, and it could have big consequences for how the U.S. is seen on the world stage. What about the impact here at home? The articles mention that people are worried about energy costs and innovation.
Those are valid concerns. The administration's saying that more drilling will bring down gas prices and help control inflation, at least in the short term. But shifting away from renewables like this, it could actually lead to higher energy costs over time, especially as the clean energy sector gets bigger and more competitive on price.
There's a gamble then. Short-term wins, but maybe higher costs later.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, the U.S. is already the world's biggest oil producer. So the question is, will more drilling really change gas prices all that much?
Good point. It sounds like the articles are asking some serious questions about how smart this approach is economically. And of course, there's the environmental impact too.
Absolutely. And on that note, let's talk about the big one, the climate crisis itself. The articles you sent paint a pretty stark picture of what we're facing. Superfloods, raging wildfires, crazy weather events, all getting worse more often.
Yeah, you've been following this issue closely, so you know how serious the science is. The longer we wait to do something, the worse those impacts will be. And we're already seeing how devastating the effects are. People are losing their homes and livelihoods.
You're right. The articles talk about the recent floods in Pakistan, the wildfires in California, and those powerful storms that ravaged the East Coast last year. It's a reminder that climate change isn't some far-off threat. It's happening now.
And it's not just environmental damage either, it's about people suffering. Economic losses, social upheaval. It's like we're heading into uncharted territory.
We are, and one of the most concerning aspects is the potential for these climate impacts to make existing inequalities even worse. It's already playing out in communities that are being hit hardest by climate change, often the ones who contributed the least to the problem.
It's a climate justice issue for sure. Speaking of uncharted territory, there's this fascinating part of the articles about Trump 2.0's moves in Greenland and with the Panama Canal. On one hand, they're cutting back climate policies, but then on the other hand, they're making moves that seem to acknowledge, even exploit, climate change for strategic advantage.
You're right. It does seem like they're trying to have it both ways. Let's dig into that. What stood out to you?
Well, the article talks about how Trump 2.0 is making a play in Greenland because the melting ice is opening up new trade routes and giving access to natural resources. And then there's the Panama Canal thing. They're worried about the canal because a key lake is drying up because of climate change. It's almost like they're saying, hey, climate change is real and we're going to use it to our advantage.
That's an interesting take. It does suggest that while they're downplaying the urgency of climate change globally, they're recognizing the impacts and maybe trying to exploit them for geopolitical gain.
It feels like a plot twist. Kind of Machiavellian, don't you think?
It definitely raises questions about how they really feel about climate change. Are they really skeptical of the science? Or are they just putting short-term economic and geopolitical interests ahead of long-term environmental sustainability?
That is the big question. And it makes you wonder, what are the implications of this kind of approach for the US and for the world?
Yeah.
Using climate change as a strategic chess piece, that feels really risky.
It does. And it could lead to more geopolitical tension and competition for resources, especially as climate change changes the world map,
Yeah.
opening up new areas and creating new challenges.
The article mentions this potential for a race to control resources in the Arctic as the ice melts. And the Panama Canal thing highlights another potential flashpoint. What if climate change disrupts a major shipping route like that? It could have huge economic and political impacts.
Exactly. And this brings up another crucial question. If the U.S. is stepping back from global leadership on climate change, who steps in?
The article mentions China, right?
Right. We saw this happen when the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Agreement before. Other nations, and even individual states in the U.S., stepped up to keep things moving on climate action. We'll probably see a similar response now. Countries like China could end up taking a more prominent role.
Okay, so we've got this complicated situation. U.S. policy's shifting, the economy's uncertain, and then there's the very real threat of climate change.
Yeah, and it's all happening right now. It's interesting when you contrast how the U.S. is approaching this with the whole idea behind the Paris Agreement. The agreement works because it's a bottom-up structure. Each country figures out what it can do to cut emissions. It depends on everyone feeling responsible and working together globally.
Yeah, I see what you mean. With the U.S. pulling back, especially because they've been such a big emitter historically, it sends a different message. Like they're saying, we're not playing by the rules, but climate change doesn't care about borders. We're seeing that with the record temperatures and crazy weather.
Exactly. Going it alone just doesn't work when you need everyone to deal with a global crisis. It throws a wrench into the whole system of international agreements and negotiations, like the Paris Agreement.
The articles you sent definitely highlight how urgent this all is. Like, we're running out of time to act.
That's right. The science is clear on this. The longer we wait, the worse the impacts will be down the road. And we're already seeing some pretty devastating stuff happening.
You're right. The articles don't shy away from the details at all. Super floods in Pakistan, wildfires in California, those powerful storms that slammed the East Coast last year. It's a reminder that climate change isn't something way off in the future. It's happening now.
Exactly. And those are just a few examples. Things like that are happening all over the world, and they're only going to get worse, more frequent, more intense as the planet warms.
Makes you wonder, if the U.S. is stepping back, who fills that leadership void? The articles mention China, right? Like, they might step up. It's definitely possible. China's been investing heavily in renewable energy. They're taking a bigger role in international climate negotiations, too. They might see this as their chance to become a global leader.
That raises a lot of questions about how geopolitics will work in a climate-changed world. But before we get too far into that, let's go back to something we touched on earlier, the economic impacts of these policy changes. You said there are both potential benefits and risks. What should we be thinking about there?
Well, on the one hand, the administration is arguing that more drilling here in the U.S. will mean lower gas prices. It'll help control inflation, they say, at least for now. They're framing it as a win for American consumers and businesses. But then there's the other side of it. Moving away from renewables like this could backfire economically over the long haul.
Especially with the U.S. potentially missing out on that clean energy boom, like we were talking about before. Yeah. Feels like a bit of a gamble to me, prioritizing the now over the future. Exactly. And the clean energy sector isn't just about the environment. It's about jobs. It's about growing the economy. Countries that are really investing in renewables are getting ready for a future where clean energy is the main source of power.
So is the risk that the U.S. falls behind in the global clean energy race, technologically and economically?
It's a real concern. A lot of experts are saying that. And it's bigger than just missing out on economic opportunities. There's the issue of energy security and resilience, too. If you depend too much on fossil fuels, you're stuck with the price swings and geopolitical instability that come with them. Investing in renewables makes you more energy independent. You create a more stable, sustainable system.
So many different factors to think about. What about the impact of climate change itself on the global economy? The articles you sent don't paint a very optimistic picture.
No, they don't. Climate change is already hitting the world economy. And as things get worse, the costs will just keep going up. Think about the damage to infrastructure, disruptions to supply chains, productivity losses, rising healthcare costs. And that's not even mentioning the human cost, people losing their homes, livelihoods, even their lives.
And what about all the people who will be forced to leave their homes because of rising sea levels, droughts, all those climate-related disasters?
That's another huge factor. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It takes all the tensions we already have, social, economic, political, prison, and makes them worse. We have to take it seriously, not just for the environment, but for human security too.
Okay, so it's this whole tangled web, political maneuvering, economic uncertainty, and the looming threat of climate change. Honestly, it's a bit overwhelming.
So let's switch gears for a second. Talk about something that's been on my mind. What can we do as individuals?
That's a great point. It's easy to feel powerless when you're up against a global challenge like this. Like, what can one person really do?
That's exactly it. So what can we do? Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Stay engaged. Don't just ignore it and hope it goes away. Learn about it. Follow the news. Talk to your friends, your family, your community about climate change.
Be aware of the problem. Understand different perspectives. Look into solutions. What about concrete actions? What can we do in our everyday lives?
There's actually a lot. Simple things can make a difference. Reduce your energy use. Choose sustainable products. Support businesses that are doing things the right way, environmentally speaking. And don't forget about the power of your voice. Tell your elected officials what you think. Advocate for policies that fight climate change. Get involved in local initiatives that are tackling these challenges in your community.
So it's about making good choices, being aware of your impact, using your voice,
Yeah,
and realizing that all those little actions can add up, especially when we're all working together.
exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are tons of people all over the world who are worried about climate change, working toward a better future.
That's good to remember. It's easy to feel alone, overwhelmed. But there's a whole movement out there, people who care about climate action. When we connect, when we share information, when we work together, we can have a real impact.
I agree. At the end of the day, it's about progress, not perfection. Every step we take in the right direction, even a small one, is a step towards a sustainable, resilient future.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, global implications of U.S. policy, how urgent the climate crisis is, international cooperation or lack thereof. And we've also touched on what individuals can do, what you listening can do.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But there's one more piece I want to look at before we wrap things up.
Oh, what's that?
One of the articles you sent said something that really made me think. It said, "This is not a war that can be won or a deal that can be sealed."
That's a powerful statement. It gets at how complicated this challenge really is. We can't just solve climate change with one policy or some new tech. It's much bigger than that. We have to change how we think and how we act. Realize that we're a part of this huge interconnected system. And what we do affects everything.
Like we have to rethink our whole relationship with the planet, right?
Sure.
Move past this idea that we can control everything and find a way to live more sustainably, more in harmony with nature.
Exactly. It's not about one side winning and the other losing. We're all in this together. Our fates are tied together.
So we're not trying to win or lose. We're trying to figure out how to thrive together, create a future where humans and nature can both do well.
That's it. And it's going to take cooperation, innovation, and a deep respect for nature. We have to recognize that our planet has limits and figure out how to live within those limits.
It's a huge task, but it's also exciting, hopeful. It's like we're being called to step up and create a whole new way of being in the world.
And that's where what we do as individuals comes in. We all have a part to play.
That takes us back to something you said before. Think globally, act locally. But what does that actually look like when it comes to climate change? It's hard to know where to even begin.
Well, you can start with simple things. Just make better choices in your everyday life. Your consumption habits, how you get around, what you buy, the companies you support. Everything you do makes a difference.
So be aware of your impact and use your spending power to support the businesses and initiatives that match your values.
Right. And use your voice. Talk to your friends and family about climate change. Get involved in your community. Push for policies that support sustainability and climate justice.
We're not just watching this happen. We have the power to make a difference. We can all be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And remember, you don't have to be perfect. Just start making changes, even small ones. Find what works for you. It's about progress, not perfection.
That's a really good point, because sometimes when you see how big this climate crisis is, it's easy to think that nothing you do matters. But you're saying that every little bit helps.
I am. Every little bit adds to the momentum for change. When enough people start doing those little things, that's when we can really change the world.
So don't underestimate what you can do. Stay informed, stay engaged, and be part of the solution.
We're all in this together. The challenges are global, but so are the opportunities. We can create a better future, one that's more just and sustainable, but we have to work together to make it happen.
That's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave you with this. The future isn't set in stone. We create it together through the choices we make each day. What kind of future do you want to build?
Keep learning. Stay curious. Let's all do our part to create a world we can be proud of, one that we can leave to the next generation.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.